Hello and welcome to Memory Notes Part 5, the real Part 5. In these notes we are strictly going to be talking about forgetting. So there's a couple things I want you guys to be aware of while you're taking these notes. So looking at the reasons why we forget, there's 7 different reasons of forgetting. You need to know all 7. And then also looking at, there's a lot of questions asked on the different graphs in these notes. So the graph that's looking at memory loss over time for forgetting, you need to know the Ebbinghaus graph that's coming up later. Make sure you're writing down things that I say, things that you see, and then any visuals that are going to help for your notes. Okay? All right, don't forget that. You're first going to start out learning about forgetting with this case study. And this is a woman named AJ, and she's a case study that's actually out of UC Irvine. And for some reason, when AJ turned 14, her memory turned into like a movie camera, just recording everything. So AJ is the opposite of the man that we learned about in the last notes that forgot everything, that couldn't make new memories. AJ remembers everything that happened to her. So we'll do a little short reading on her in class, but because there's so little evidence, or not evidence, but information out there on this type of phenomenon, it's considered a case study, so just looking at one person. So her brain is unable to forget everything since the age of 14. Okay, so let's look at why we forget and what exactly forgetting is. So Schachter is a scientist you need to know with memory, and he really studied why people forget things. So the retention rates over time of new information learned, why certain things are forgotten or suppressed. And he broke this in, so they call it the 7 sins of forgetting, and it's broken into the sins of memory. It's broken into 3 different chunks. So I'm going to kind of go forward a little bit. So stop writing. I'm going to go forward. So it's going to be the sins of forgetting. That's 1. So there's 3 of those. There's going to be the sins of distortion, so things that go wrong. And then 1, the sin of intrusion. So those are going to add up to 7 because sins of distortion have 3, sins of forgetting have 3, and then intrusion is going to be 1. These are not vocab, but you need to know them. So these are, I don't know why your book doesn't make these vocab terms, but all these things here that are bulleted, make sure that you have them as vocab words. Okay, so these words right here, all right, that I'm underlining, I'll stop right now, but anything that has a bullet, all right? So forgetting, so there's 3 different things you know about forgetting. So make sure you're writing down examples. So these are just the definitions in your margin. Maybe leave some notes for examples. Okay, so absent-mindedness. This is just our inattention to detail. If I were to ask you what color shirt I was wearing yesterday or 3 days ago, or what you had for breakfast 4 days ago, it's not necessarily that you are forgetting that information. You just were never paying attention to that detail. We talked about how your sensory information takes in so much sensory, so much sound and light and feeling and taste, that if you're not paying attention to it, making a conscious effort to try and look at it, your brain probably doesn't pick up on it. So it's just inattention to detail. You can't remember where you put your keys because you were distracted while you were doing something else. Okay? Transience is stored to decay over time. This could be not because you're not using it, because things just happen in life. So you might know everyone's name in class right now, or your freshman year you knew everybody in your math class, and because you don't see them, you forget their name. So it's storage decay over time. I know all of my students' names every single semester, and then when I see them 3 years later, sometimes I'm like, oh, hey, you. It's not that I didn't know it, I just, because that I never had to access that memory again or saw that person, that memory decays over time. And then blocking is the inaccessibility of stored information. This one right here is like that tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you see an actor, you're thinking of an actor in a movie, and you know it's in your brain somewhere, you're just like, oh, I can't think of it right now, that's like on the tip of my tongue. So that's blocking. It's the inaccessibility of stored information. It's in there, you're just not able to get to it right now. Okay, so those are the sins of forgetting. All right, the 7, so continue with the 7 sins of memory. Now there's sins of distortion, meaning that it's distorted or changed somehow. So the first one is going to be misattribution. This is something called source amnesia. So you remember who said it, but you forget where it came from. So a lot of the times these become like your own stories. You remember something, a story about someone who had a bad experience somewhere, but you can't remember who said it, so you just kind of take it on as your own. Or even looking back on memories, you might think that this actually did happen to you. So misattribution, the confusion of source or where that actually came from. You remember the memory, just not where it came from. Suggestibility, this is, there's been some interesting research done on children that were like planted the idea that someone hurt them as a child or sexually molested them as a child. So the lingering effects of misinformation. You might come away with something, or someone might, what has been shown with kids is that they ask them at a young age, like, did so-and-so touch you in a suggestive way? And even if though they didn't, you might remember that kind of lingering effect of someone asking you that, and might actually then in the future have a memory of it, even though it didn't happen. So that's suggestibility, the effects of other people's questioning on your memory. And then bias, this is, we've talked about bias a couple times. We've looked at confirmation bias, being biased might actually make you remember something differently. So someone you like, you might think of a memory a little bit differently than if someone you didn't like. So the same thing happened, but because of your bias or those belief-colored recollections, you might remember it better. So this is distorted memory. The memory exists, you're able to access it, it's just distorted or changed in some way. And then the sins of intrusion, so persistence. This is where unwanted memories. So things that you might want to forget that kind of pop up ever so often. So persistence, like the inability to forget. All right, so that's a sin of intrusion. It kind of intrudes itself into your memory even when it's not wanted. All right, so let's look at some type of inattention to detail. I want you to think of a penny, right? How often you've seen a penny before. How often you have used pennies, held them, looked at them. But have you ever really paid attention to the detail of a penny? Probably not. Are you thinking like, yeah, I know what a penny is, but look at these 6 pictures here and think about, can you pick out which penny is correct? Which year is correct? So there's 1976, there's 1974 on there. Which way is Lincoln's head facing? What does it say on top, on the face or in the back? Okay, so this might be an encoding failure. It's not that you knew what a penny looked like when you were younger. You probably never paid attention, so just the inattention to detail. This is an encoding failure. Encoding, you never learned it. You never encoded it properly, so you weren't able to bring out that memory, or even identify, so even recognize, because you never encoded it properly. Okay? The right answer is the first one, which made me mad, because when I first looked at this, I thought for sure it was, I think this one right here. I don't know why. Because I associate Lincoln with liberty and in God we trust and the years, and anyways, this is the correct one. Now, you might remember a penny because you have this idea and you look at it and you'll continue to do that. Okay, so that's called an encoding failure. There's 2 different types of reasons why we forget. It may be, so this chart, even though you have it copied down a couple times, hopefully, this is where encoding doesn't happen. So it went into our working short-term memory. I saw a penny, I was using a penny in the past, I've used it a bunch of times, but I never properly encoded it to my long-term memory because I wasn't paying attention, because other things got in the way. So this is called an encoding failure, and that leads to forgetting. It's never properly put or encoded into my memory. Now that is different. Oh, I'm sorry, and now we're going to look at storage decay. But that's different from something that's in my long-term memory and I'm not unable to retrieval. So there's a retrieval failure as well. We'll look at those later. But first, let's look at the storage decay. So storage decay. Sorry, so things that are in your memory. And this is the graph, the forgetting curve we have up on the wall that I mentioned in our last notes. This is the one I was thinking of and talking about. So this is a guy named Ebbinghaus, the same guy. He looked at the percentage of retained over time. So not how many times they rehearsed it, but just you had it down the first day and looking at over time if you never look at that information again. All right, so it's just like the transients, it's over time. So Ebbinghaus found, and this is the one up on our wall, that after the first day there's a rapid loss of memory. So you need to know the beginning there's a rapid loss of memory, but then it levels off. So it dropped from 60 to about 25, and that's about where it stays. Okay, so this is the time in days since learning the list. It levels off, a rapid drop, and then it levels off, okay? Now let's look at that. He looked at this with people who studied a second language. So you may have taken Spanish class your freshman year and you haven't taken it since. If you knew 100% of the original vocabulary, and this is looking at time and years after they completed their Spanish course. So considering that you started out with 100% vocabulary, after about a year, so if you kind of follow it up here, it drops to about 70. So you still might remember a good amount of it, especially with some retrieval cues. 3 years drops down to 40, but then see how it kind of levels off? Goes up a little bit back. So this was a study done with Spanish. I'm not quite sure why it would peak or go back up a little bit more after 15 years or 5. Maybe it's just because the attention to what you're trying to remember. But there is this leveling off where it never drops quite below 30%, even when you get to be 50, 60 years old. All right, so that's my Ebbinghaus curve, rapid drop, and then it levels off. Now let's talk about retrieval failure. So I talked about earlier the encoding failure. Assuming that you encoded it properly, what are some things that could go wrong with failure to bring it back out? So it's in your long-term memory somehow. I just need to get it out. All right, so this is a retrieval failure versus an encoding failure. So there's 2 vocab words we're going to talk about with retrieval failure, and they are both interfere with being able to retrieve a stored memory. It's in my long term, I can't get it out. So there's 2 different types of interference. There's an example chart coming up, but I want you to know, so proactive interference is is prior knowledge getting in the way. It's forward acting. So prior knowledge is getting in the way of forward thinking. Retroactive is backwards acting. So my new information is getting in the way of something that I used to know. All right. I always think of like retro as kind of like with math, but let's look at a chart. I do want you to pay attention to this one right here. This could be a really big implication for you with studying. So this is hours of elapsed after you've learned like a random list, again, of vocab. And this is sleep, so there's no interference going on. And this is after remaining awake. So if you studied or memorized something right before you went to bed, and there was absolutely no interference before you, I'm going to say like took your test, so you studied right before you went to sleep and took it first thing in the morning, you have a higher recall of the list because there's been no interference, nothing else your brain has had to do. Versus if you learned it and then went on to your other classes and stayed awake and talked to your friends. So after remaining awake, hours elapsed after learning syllables, the percentage retained goes down a lot. You should really think about this before cramming for a test right before you go to sleep, and then not having having as little interference as possible before you take that test. This is really bad news for us because our AP Psych test is at noon. You'll have a lot of interference. Maybe I'll let you sleep for an hour before. All right, so let's talk about proactive and retroactive. So let's talk about, so if you make this chart on your, it's not going to be very big, just make a little T-chart. At the top, put an earlier event and a later event, and on the side we're going to put proactive and retroactive. Remember, interference, getting things back out. So if my earlier event is that I learned a friend's email address in high school, so a couple years ago I learned it in high school, and a later event for proactive interference, so prior knowledge, is going to get in the way of familiar old addresses interfering with interfering with the new colleagues. So I have this prior knowledge that's getting in the way of me remembering a new thing. All right? Retroactive is learning a new password for a bank card and then no longer being able to remember my last one. Okay, so I learned my new telephone number, and now for some reason I can't figure out the old stuff. What I was talking about with math is sometimes I felt like I really knew like my algebra 2 or my pre-calc, and then when I got into calculus, like learning all that new information like got in the way of me remembering how to do algebra 2, right? I could no longer access that information. Versus the other way around, if you learn something earlier and that getting in the way, like in a math class, and then it changes, it gets in the way of learning new information. So pro is prior knowledge getting in the way. Retro is new information getting in the way of old. All right, you really need to know the differences between those two. Maybe highlight or circle that and we'll talk about it in class. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be motivated forgetting. So why someone would want to forget. So this is, it's thought that this is a self-serving for your personal history. There are things that you purposely repress or try to forget. So you're not trying to access those so that you are not disturbed by it, or maybe things you just don't want to remember. All right, so repression is not wanting to recall or retrieve an earlier memory. And then this chart to the side, I kind of just put this over here. I really like this in the terms of the visuals. So maybe I'll have you draw this in class and just kind of jot it down right now. But this is looking at like the amount of information that comes in at each level. So that chart that we had going across, now this is talking about that goes on at each level. So your sensory memory, it says the sentence momentarily registered amazing detail. So you get a ton of information coming into your sensory memory. The amount that goes to your working short term for just a few seconds or a limited amount of time is more limited, right? So you pick and choose from all your sensories which things that you need, which are important to work with, and those ones that are noticed are encoded. The long-term storage are all those things that aren't altered or lost put into your long-term memory, and then the retrieval is even less. So you probably have a lot more things in your long-term than you can retrieve, but you have a lot more things in your working than you actually made a long term. So I really liked, for me, this visual right here of the percentage that is lost or forgot over time at each stage. Okay, so I think that's really important to know. In our next notes on memory, there's still more, we're going to talk about memory construction with what we kind of did in class with the rumor has it, and looking at what happens when we have misinformation or make wrong memories. Okay, I will see you later.